Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 65 of Contemplating Life. This week we take a break from reminiscing about my college days to talk about my lifelong obsession with motorsports. In May 1959, just 2 months short of my 4th birthday, my family moved into a newly built house in the Eagledale neighborhood on the northwest side of Indianapolis. 65 years later, I still live in the same house, located about a quarter-mile northwest of the fourth turn of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. IMS is the site of the annual Indianapolis 500 race. You can hear cars practicing throughout the month of May in preparation for the big race. My parents are natives of Indianapolis and have been race fans most of their life, and living so close to the track, it's only natural that I caught the bug as well. The title of this episode is 30 Days in May, which may seem strange because obviously there are 31. But in Indianapolis, we talk about 30 Days of May. That's often the title of TV shows about the Indy 500. That's because traditionally, practice for the Indy 500 opened on May 1st and culminated on May 30th with the race. When I was growing up, May 30th was the fixed date to celebrate Memorial Day. In 1971, Memorial Day and other federal holidays were made into Monday holidays. Practice sessions for the race still began on May 1st, but the race was moved to the Sunday before Memorial Day, giving Monday a potential rain date. Practice for the race now starts even later in May, but people still talk about racing in Indianapolis as occupying, quote, the month of May, end quote, as if it was still taking up 30 of the 31 days of the month. As I mentioned before, my parents are lifelong race fans, and I heard many stories about their visits to the track when they were young. My dad's favorite story was from his teenage years. He and a bunch of his buddies got in a car and lined up extremely early in the morning to get a good parking spot in the infield. They were probably in the north end of the track, inside the third or the fourth turns. He was designated to walk the entire length of the infield to Gate 2 on 16th Street at the south end of the track to meet my mom and the other gals. This was before they were married, though. He escorted them to the north end of the track, where the guys had already been hitting the pier pretty heavily. As he walked the length of the infield, escorting a half dozen attractive women, guys kept calling out to him and saying, "Hey, buddy, that's not fair. You got to share some of that with us." Dad said he just kept smiling, walking, enjoying all the attention, being surrounded by all these pretty women. In May 1961, my parents took me to the track for the first time. I was a couple of months short of my 6th birthday, and there are photos of me on that day in the YouTube version of the podcast. It was on a Saturday or a Sunday when qualifications were underway. Only the fastest 33 qualifiers would make the race, and in those days there were many more than 33 entries, so you weren't guaranteed a spot unless you were in the top 33 speeds. According to Wikipedia, 26 drivers failed to qualify for the 1961 race. Qualifications consisted of 4 consecutive fast laps. Your average speed for those 4 laps was your qualifying time. Qualifying took place on the 2 weekends prior to the race, so I don't remember which of the 4 qualifying days we attended back in '61. We sat in the grandstands on the outside of the main straight. My dad carried me in my wheelchair up a few steps, removed a folding chair, and put my wheelchair in its place. I had been hearing race cars from my house since I was 3 years old, and I'd seen them on TV, but seeing it in person and hearing the roar of the engines up close was a phenomenal experience. I enjoyed every second of it. On the other side of the track was the pits where the cars are serviced. and there was another grandstand beyond that in the infield facing us. I could see people in the top row of that far grandstand turning around to look at the cars as they went down the backstretch. I thought that the backstretch was just beyond those grandstands. I didn't realize the backstretch was almost a quarter-mile away. But the people at the top of the grandstands could see the cars going down the backstretch because there was nothing to block their view. Later in the day, my dad took me through the Gate 7 tunnel under the track into the infield. As we walked along the paved walkway behind the infield grandstands, I thought we were walking on the backstretch of the track itself. I kept saying to my dad, "Don't we need to get out of the way?" He finally explained to me the backstretch was way over that way as he pointed east. And while we had been sitting in the front stretch grandstands, driver Norm Hall spun out in the first turn, beyond where I could see. The PA announcer said, "Norm Hall hit the wall." I go, "Hey, that rhymes." And I began singing, "Norm Hall hit the wall, Norm Hall hit the wall." Now, although the driver wasn't injured, my dad stopped me and explained that hitting a wall at over 140 miles an hour was not something to be singing about. When he took me to the infield, Dad took me to the fence around the famous Gasoline Alley garage area. Looking through the fence, I could see the damaged car that had been driven by Norm Hall, and then I realized how right my dad was. I've told that story many times over the years, but as I was looking up the details about that era while preparing this episode, I just learned something new about the 1961 Indianapolis 500 season. According to Wikipedia, driver Tony Bettenhausen Sr. was killed in a crash during practice on May 12, 1961. That was the Friday before the first weekend of qualifying. Wikipedia says, begin quote, "He was testing a car for Paul Russo. It was determined that an anchor bolt fell off the front radius rod support, permitting the front axle to twist and misalign the front wheels when the brakes were applied. The car plunged into the outside wall, then rode along the top, snapping fence poles and tearing segments of the catch fence. The car came to rest upside down on top the outside wall. Bettenhausen was killed instantly. Before the time trials, Bettenhausen had been the favorite to become the first driver to break the 150-mile-per-hour barrier at the speedway." End quote. Now, I'm certain that my dad must have known that the driver had been killed just a few days before. And although he didn't tell me about that fatal crash, I'm sure that's why he made sure I understood that racing is a dangerous sport. The following year, driver Parnelli Jones became the first to break the 150-mile-per-hour barrier at the track during qualifying. His first lap speed was a track record of 150.729 miles per hour, and all 4 laps of his qualifying attempt were above 150, with a 4-lap average of 150.370 miles per hour. I have vague recollections of hearing about this milestone. They made a big deal about breaking the 150 barrier. As I researched the 1962 race to see when that 150 barrier was broken, I also read that Norm Hall crashed twice in 1962. He was uninjured the first time, but he had another crash in a backup car. He hit the first turn wall backwards and was severely injured, including a fractured leg and a possible skull fracture. He eventually recovered and went on to race in the 1964 and 65 racing seasons. Wikipedia says he died in 1992 at the age of 66. I don't recall returning to the track for many years, but I remained a race fan. there was extensive news coverage of the race each year. The 3 major local TV stations had film crews at the track every day, and there would be a 15-minute segment of the local evening news dedicated to track coverage. If you had heard there was an accident that day, you were always anxious to see if they had film of it. There would be driver interviews, and each station had their own driver expert to comment on the day's events. The race itself typically was not televised in those days. According to an article in the Indianapolis Star from August 2020, the race was first televised in 1949 in an attempt to sell televisions. The first TVs went on sale in Indianapolis early that year. The Speedway permitted local station WFBM Channel 6 to televise the race locally. They had 3 cameras along the front stretch and covered the entire race. It's estimated that 3,000 households tuned in. The race was televised again locally in 1950, and there was talk of a nationally syndicated broadcast, but the Speedway decided it would hurt ticket sales, and they refused to let the race be televised for many years. Since 1951, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Radio Network has provided live coverage of the race each year, and that was my primary way of following the event for many years. We would typically have some sort of cookout or other activities for Memorial Day, and we would sit and listen to the radio intently. My mom would take notes because they would give a rundown of the position of each car about every 20 laps or so. She wanted to see where her favorite drivers were. And later I took up that practice myself for a while. The 1964 race was memorable for all the wrong reasons. My dad and I were in the backyard listening to the race on the radio. My mom went with some friends to see the race in person. They had good seats on the infield grandstand at the main stretch. My next-door neighbor, Mike Tillery, would have been about 10 or 11 years old at the time, climbed up onto a storage shed in his backyard. Each year at the start of the race, they would release thousands of helium balloons from a tent, and he wanted to see the balloons flying through the air. Just a couple of laps into the race, he shouted, "There must have been a big wreck. I could see black smoke." Indeed, reports came over the radio that there had been a massive, fiery crash in the 4th turn, which was the turn closest to my house. The race was red-flagged and stopped while the track was cleared. Eventually, we got the word that popular veteran driver Eddie Sachs and rookie driver Dave McDonald were killed in the accident. My mom could not see the wreck clearly from where she was sitting, but she could see the flames and plume of black smoke. It sickened her when she realized there had to be drivers burning alive in those flames. She said later, when the PA announcer revealed to the crowd that the 2 drivers had been fatally injured, a creepy silence came over the crowd. She said all you could hear was transistor radios that people had that were listening to the race coverage while they were there. The radios were still on the air because they did not release the news there until it was released to the crowd at the Speedway. My mom did not return to the Speedway for many years. She'd been a big fan of Eddie Sachs, who was one of the most personable and popular drivers of that era. I've linked a Wikipedia article about the incident. There was controversy because Dave McDonald's car was a radical new design. Other drivers had refused to drive it, and some drivers who saw it in practice and in the opening laps felt that it was a dangerous design and should not have been allowed on the track. Now, normally when I talk about historical events, I try to put YouTube clips into the YouTube version of the podcast. But I will not be doing that for these fatal crashes. They're quite gruesome. I will provide links to those videos, but viewer discretion is highly recommended. I have a few more stories of fatal accidents at the Speedway that occurred when I was present, and I'll save those for later. I believe my next visit to the Speedway must have been when I was 8 or 9 years old. My mother was the den mother of my Boy Scout troop. It was a troop consisting of all handicapped kids from Robert's school. I don't remember many details of the visit, but I know that Mom or one of the other troop leaders persuaded a few drivers to come by and sign autographs for the kids. As I mentioned previously, practice for the race typically opened May 1st, and there was qualifying during the 2 weekends prior to the race itself. In the week between the last day of qualifying and race day, there was one short day of practice on Thursday. Traditionally, this has been called Carburation Day, or Carb Day. It was the day in which drivers could have a final practice session to adjust their carburetors. Now, although Indy cars have not had carburetors for decades, the name Carb Day still persists. It's a great tradition in Indianapolis for kids to cut school that day. That is, kids of all ages. Adults are also known to take a personal day off for the Thursday before race day. I don't recall specifically any other trips to the Speedway, although I might have gone to qualifying days when I was a teenager. After graduating high school and entering college, my final exams were always the first week of May. That meant summer vacation was for the rest of the month until late August. In high school, school did not let out till the first week of June. When I realized I was going to be free for much of May, I was ecstatic. I would have my mom drop me off in the early afternoon, and I would roam around the infield all day on practice days. Then she would pick me up around dinner time, perhaps a little before 5 p.m. The track closed at 6. We discovered there was something called a season pass available. It would give you admission to the grounds for all the practice and qualifying days, but not for race day itself. You needed a separate ticket for that. Included with the package was the garage pass that would give you access to the gasoline alley garage area. Technically, you were supposed to be 21. However, at age 18, if I had a garage pass, no one was going to question me for further ID. I had a small Kodak Model 20 pocket Instamatic camera that I would use to take still pictures. Together, my dad and I designed a gadget that attached to the camera. It included a lever about 3 inches long that would help me push the shutter button. I had to hold the camera upside down, but that's no problem. I recently discovered a huge stack of old photos in a box, and I have scanned many of them and included them in the YouTube version of this podcast. These are photos I took myself. In many ways, I enjoyed hanging out in Gasoline Alley and watching them work on the cars more than I enjoyed watching the cars themselves. Part of that was because there was not a good place to see the track in a wheelchair. You could roam up and down the fence along the pits, but it was difficult to see the track itself from ground level. The infield area of the first turn was a fun place to hang out. Somehow it was given the nickname the Snake Pit. Young people would gather there to party and drink, and the girl-watching opportunities were phenomenal. Lots of women would run around in bikini bathing suits or skimpy halter tops. If they were drunk enough, sometimes the guys would persuade them to flash their tits. Now that I think about it, I think the Snake Pit was the first place I ever saw bare breasts in real life that wasn't in a magazine. Sometimes the Snake Pit was a treacherous place for a wheelchair because it was often quite muddy. I remember venturing there after a heavy rain, and the front wheels of my wheelchair sank into the mud all the way up to my footrest. I had to rely on help from strangers to get me out of the mess. My front wheels were about 6 inches in diameter, very narrow, and had spoked wheels. I came home with those wheels caked solid with mud, as well as a considerable amount of mud on my rear wheels. My mother was not very happy. We had to turn the hose on the wheelchair before I got in the house. I remember one rainy qualifying day that I spent at the track with my cousin J.R. I was probably 18 or 19. He would have been about 12 or 13. My Aunt Jody was volunteering at a concession stand as a fundraiser for some organization. She was counting on me to keep J.R. out of trouble. Naturally, we went straight to the snake pit to party. I don't believe we saw any naked women there that day, but unfortunately, we did see a naked man. This was back in the days when the practice of streaking naked in public events had become popular. Some drunk guy stripped down, ran across the track, which was closed because it was still drying out from a rainstorm, and tried to climb over the fence. He got various tender parts of his body hung up on the wire along the top of the fence. He was arrested after he managed to get untangled and get down off of the fence. I remember during that first visit to the track, the cars were going over 140 miles per hour, and as I said, the following year, they broke 150. Throughout my years as a race fan, the records fell on a regular basis. The first day of qualifying each year is known as pole day because it establishes the pole position for the start of the race. That's the number one position. Massive crowds would attend pole day qualifying in anticipation of seeing track records fall. Famous track announcer Tom Carnegie had a unique way of announcing it. He would say,
"It's a new track record,"
and the crowd would cheer wildly. I was in attendance on May 14, 1977, when driver Tom Sneva was the first to turn an official lap at over 200 miles per hour. I don't recall if I was there for earlier track records, but I know I was there for many more after that. Some of them in attendance with my friends Rich and Kathy Logan. I know for a fact that I was there on May 11, 1996, when the track record fell 4 times in one day. When it was all over with, the record was held by Ari Lyondike with a single lap speed of 237.498 miles per hour and a 4-lap average of 236.986 miles per hour. Those records still stand to this day because the following year rule changes slowed the cars down. Last year's 4-lap average speed for pole position was 233.947. I don't think we'll ever see a new track record again, because if the cars manage to go much faster, they'll make additional rule changes to slow them down for the sake of safety. They've tried to modify the qualifying procedures to make pole day more exciting, and it helps a little bit, but it'll never recapture the excitement of seeing those records fall, and it just won't be the same without the late Tom Carnegie announcing,
"It's a new track record."
Next week, we'll tell more stories about my history as a race fan, including the first time I ever attended the actual race in person. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. Although my finances are a mess, I'm not in this for the money, but every little bit helps. As always, my deepest thanks to all my financial supporters. That means more to me than I could possibly express. Even if you cannot provide financial support, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to be able to hear my stories. All my back episodes are available, so check them out if you're new to the podcast. If you have any comments or questions or feedback, please feel free to post on any of the platforms where you find the podcast. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe. Or maybe this week I should say, drive safe.